Thank you again for joining today's webinar. And now I'd like to introduce and welcome today's presenters. Steve Cremando, founder and principal of Behavior Sciences Applications, LLC. George Siegel, Senior Director of Excellence Critical Event Management Solutions at Everbridge. And Sean McDevitt, Enterprise Sales Engineering Manager, also of Everbridge. So welcome, gentlemen. If you need their bios, full bios can be found in the speaker biography box, again to the right of the presentation slides, just under the media player. So again, welcome, gentlemen. Steve, I'll hand things over to you.
Well, thanks, Raquel, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Really going back to how Raquel mentioned or categorized the title of the program, really what our focus will be, at least really focus a bit in my section, on what's different. You know, we're at a very, very unique moment in time where different sorts of psychological elements, different sorts of behavioral elements are in flux. And they are having a very significant effect on the active shooter threat environment. And not only are we going to talk about this in some general ways, we're going to talk about it in some ways that are very specific to the moment. And my hope would be, in sharing this, an opportunity perhaps to mature our active shooter response, our active assailant response plans, as well as really think about recalibrating for the new reality of people returning to work after the pandemic and all the challenges we have ahead. So in jumping into this discussion of the human element, lots of ground to cover, beginning with a very, very quick introduction to our approach. If you're not familiar with the concept of operational psychology, different than PSYOPs or psychological operations, operational psychology is the use of clinical, cognitive, and social psychological ideas for their tactical or their operational value. So this is not psychological information intended to talk about diagnosis, assessment, or treatment of mental health conditions. It is really about what people do and don't do and how that affects our readiness and response to active shooter threats and other emergencies. So we're going to be looking through this lens of operational psychology through this block of discussion. Now, when we think about behavior, it is one of the two critical elements of the security equation. There is security stuff, all of our technology, ranging from very, very sophisticated technologies to the things we see every day in our environment, card readers, cameras, all sorts of security apparatus. But there's also security behaviors, the things that people do and don't do. And in this graphic here, very quickly, if we see someone piggybacking in past our security checkpoint, obviously that behavior can defeat all of the very sophisticated security technology we have. We have an employee stepping out the back door, propping it open with a rock to get a smoke, and then leaving it propped open as they come back into the workplace. That can undo all of the elaborate security sorts of mechanisms we have. So security behavior and security technology always go hand in hand, and it's important in this moment in history to understand what is changing in both of those domains. My focus will be on the behavior. Sean and George will talk more about the technology. Now this matters, the behavioral piece matters very much because our plans, our policies, our procedures, and even our exercises around active shooter need to be behaviorally accurate, understanding what people are most likely to do and not do in different situations. And when we don't get the people piece of this right, it could leave our approach ineffective, inappropriate, in that we may under or overreact to a situation, and in so actually becoming potentially dangerous. So there's a tremendous importance in understanding both the technology but the human factor, and talk about how the human factor is in this moment in time. So our launch pad that you'll hear throughout the entire webinar today is Lewin's equation. Now, some of you may have heard this before. Dr. Kurt Lewin, thought to be the father of social psychology, had very famously said that human behavior is a function of the interaction between the person and the environment. So kind of, the way we always look at things from a psychosocial standpoint, we need to understand the unique aspects of a person and people in general and what's going on around them. And what's going on around them is very complex. When we think about the people piece of this, there's a number of ways even to parse that dynamic. There's the behavior of the shooter or shooters. There is all of those motives, all of the pre-incident indicators. The FBI tells us that there are at least 4 or 5 good behavioral indicators observable in most active shooters in the run-up to the event. So there are different things that are happening for the potential attacker. There are things we need to understand and anticipate in terms of our workforce, how they act under stress, how they act even when we introduce and train around the topic of active shooter. But when we think about violence, it's important to understand that violence is not an event, it is a process. People don't just snap, they make a decision when they engage in violence. So we're going to spend some time thinking about the violent actor from a behavioral standpoint and spend a few moments thinking about the workforce and their behavior both before, during, and after an active shooter event as well. So in thinking about the potential perpetrator of the violence, as I said, we know that this usually arises out of a smoldering crisis, not out of a sudden crisis. We see people, again, move along what today is referred to as the pathway to violence over time. And what that says to us is there are usually opportunities for intervention and creating off-ramps so people do not advance to violence. What this means at the bottom line is that there's opportunities in the early stages, and we should take advantage of those to intervene because this can and very often does escalate. Now, the sort of violence that we talk about in active shooter or active assailant threats is referred to as targeted violence. Targeted violence is predatory violence. It is not someone who just snaps. It's not a road rage situation in most instances where someone just loses it. So if you look at the graphics here of the difference between predatory violence and affective, which is emotionally driven violence, that affective violence is reactive. It's in the moment. It's the person who thinks we cut them off in traffic or we took their parking spot at the mall, and they lose control. They just freak out, and they think they're doing this again to change the situation, right? And it tends to be very time limited. Predatory violence happens over a longer time frame, and it is not someone losing control. You hear the phrase or see the phrase here about autonomic arousal, elevation in heart rate, blood pressure, respiration. This is not a person who loses control. This is not a person who's red in the face and screaming, yelling, and cussing. This is a person who moves through the shooting environment cool as a cucumber, in complete control. So there's radical differences in predatory violence and affective violence. But we're speaking today about someone who's moving along the pathway to violence, which you'll notice in this graphic to the right, begins with a grievance and starts to manifest into a violent ideation, again, and then onto the potential for an attack. But you also notice in this graphic, as I mentioned, there are usually clear pre-incident indicators. Now, one of the things that's changed in the moment is right now we have people under more stress than probably any other time in recent history. When we look at the FBI reports, Secret Service reports, and other studies, we know that individuals struggling with mental health stressors, that is actually the number one sort of driver or stress associated with active shooter incidents. Now, do not misunderstand this, that individuals with mental illness are necessarily the higher level of risk for being an active shooter. That's not what any of the science tells us. People with mental illnesses are no more likely to be violent than the average person, but 62% of those cases where we've studied active shooters, we see mental health challenges and stressors as the number one sort of contributing variable. Let's look at where we are at the moment. The most current APA, American Psychological Association Stress in America survey tells us that more than half of the U.S. population has experienced deterioration in their mental health functioning over the last 2 years during the pandemic. And the bottom graphic here, this from the National Center for Mental Health in the UK, is the projection that even as the medical implications of COVID begin to trail off, the mental health implications are actually just starting. So we are in the possibility of having what's being referred to as a shadow pandemic. We're just experiencing the very long tail of the pandemic in which the mental health consequences are likely to last much longer. And this is manifested as stress, as exhaustion, as people being on edge and being irritable, increased anger, increased problems in daily functioning. So even though we may see some changes in the medical risk, the mental health implications and how they relate to active shooter threat are actually increasing at this moment. Now, when we think about the warning behaviors, and these are not warning signs, like, the person is a loner. We talk about different dynamic sorts of patterns of behavior to tell us that someone may be on a pathway to violence, where they are on the pathway, and if they're accelerating on the pathway. And these are empirically sound indicators. Now, if you are not familiar with what we refer to as the proximal warning behaviors, I've left there a link to an FBI bulletin back from April 2016, which is a quick review of the proximal and distal indicators, proximal being near term, distal being long term. But we know that several of these are very significant in the immediate active shooter threat environment, which means what we have today, given all that's going on in the world around us. That environment I spoke of in Lewin's equation, it is not just the workplace. It is what's going on in the war in East Europe. It's what's going on in the economy. It's what's going on in terms of people going back and forth to hybrid work environments, back into the traditional workplace. All of these things constitute the environment, as well as things like climate anxiety, the prevalence of wildfires and storms in the coming seasons. Everything constitutes that environment and affects levels of stress, affects the possibility of people feeling that they are being victimized, that they have a grievance that may put them onto the pathway for violence. But we also have to anticipate in your planning and preparedness the behavior of employees, the behavior not only of anyone in the workforce, but also of your security team and emergency responders who are in-house, and the behavior of incoming law enforcement and other first responders under this sort of acute stress. Shots fired. You are entering essentially a combat environment, a deadly force environment in which our physiological and psychological sort of reaction is very, very powerful and will shape the outcome. We have to account for this in our planning, in our policies, but also in our exercises, that we're modeling the right behaviors. This sort of stress radically changes how people behave in the moment. So there's a whole discussion to be had on the psychology of the shooter. And we touched on just a few of those key elements in the moment today, where we are in terms of the pandemic and other stressors in our environment. And then we understand that those stressors also affect everyone else in the environment when a shot is fired. When we think about victims and witnesses of the situation, those in a live fire environment, we know panic is actually much more likely. Now, that may seem like a very basic and simple statement, but you do have to appreciate that panic is actually unlikely in most other disaster scenarios. But panic, based in the perception, real or imagined, of limited opportunity for escape or limited availability of critical supplies, is a reality in the moment when a shot is fired. And panicked individuals are thinking only of their immediate survival needs. People stampeding for the doors, for the stairs, all again can cause additional harm. We have to anticipate how we communicate, how we share information to help suppress this sort of behavior, because it is deep brain response. In the moment, this is a primal reaction. The shot is fired, someone's screaming shooter, alarms are going off, all the things that are happening around us in an active shooter environment trigger a very profound and very immediate physiological response. And when this kicks in, there's part of the brain, the limbic system, that regulates emotion, and more specifically, as you see in the graphic, that part of the limbic system known as the amygdala regulates fear. It radically changes our behavior. We see problem solving, decision-making, judgment, logic, reasoning, impulse control, and verbal processing literally go out the window. We could show you this in PET scans, in MRIs, and other sorts of neuroimaging, how the brain changes in its function under extreme stress. So we are in a moment where everyone is running at a very, very high level of stress. it's going to affect the potential actor or shooter in terms of advancing them along that pathway from grievance to ideation to action. It's going to affect the workforce in terms of how they're taking in information in our planning and our training, as well as in the moment of a real crisis, and understand that that environment we're in right now is very unique and extremely dynamic. It is changing day by day. The other thing we know is many people are very fixated at the moment on newscasts from around the world, things to do with the military conflict in Eastern Europe, things to do with changes in the pandemic and potential new variants, all of these things happening simultaneously. So when we think about our active shooter plans, policies, procedures, they do need to be adapted to this unique environment that we're in. They're always subject to being revised and recalibrated for the moment that we're in, because human behavior is constantly shifting. When we think about this, having grown up during the Vietnam era, how people watched the news and watched the war unfold today is so radically different than in the 60s or the 70s. People are getting information in real time on devices in their pockets and their purses all day long. So we're in a very different situation regarding those environmental stresses, including those people who may be working from home or working now in hybrid environments. We know there's been emotional consequences, behavioral consequences to working through the pandemic. For people working remotely, that's meant sometimes isolation, working in close quarters with spouses and partners and children who may be doing schooling from home, increased financial stresses for many people, but the real threat of illness and many people being sick, and certainly the grief involved with many people losing family members to the pandemic, has created a tremendous emotional burden. And the environment, simply because pandemics are predictably unpredictable, has created a tremendous degree of uncertainty, and that certainty drives anxiety. If you came into this pandemic already with different behavioral health or substance abuse challenges, it's likely they've been made worse by this current environment. And for people, again, as per the APA or American Psychological Survey, many people, even without prior mental health challenges, are struggling in this environment. We know there's other challenges when it comes to safety and security as well. Working in a hybrid environment blurs lines. The traditional brick and mortar work environment where we can control security in such a different way, including the risk of active shooter and how we train for active shooter, all changes when people are working all their time or part of their time from home, including just a general complacency that nothing bad can happen when I'm just working at home. It creates a tremendous illusion of safety and a bias that we are, again, immune in some way from bad actors and dangerous actions. But we know being in these environments actually is a soft target, because now we have people, again, who may be struggling in some way that's moving them towards that pathway to violence, who are not being spotted, not being seen by a coworker, not being seen by a supervisor. We have decreased sensors. And in this way, I mean those individuals or systems that might spot someone who is struggling. If they're working from home, it can be harder to gauge in a Zoom contact or another contact on video how they're doing. People could pull it together for 10 minutes or an hour even on a video call and seem that they're doing well, when behind the scene, they really may emotionally be falling apart. And lastly, we may have new hires or younger workers who have never worked in the office environment before, who don't have the same loyalty to the organization, who don't have any baseline behavior for coworkers or supervisors to measure when there are behavioral changes that may be indicative that someone is moving towards violence. So to wrap up this quick behavioral discussion and then pass it to George and Sean to talk about the integration with technology, remember that this moment in time is unique. Always the human factor in security is one of those two critical elements. But the human factor, as well as our environment, is so subject to change. People will always be your organization's greatest asset, and at the same time, your greatest vulnerability. So it will be important to continue to understand acclimate to, and address the human behavior associated with these moments in time as we go forward. But to truly protect your organization, again, we must consider both the person and the environment as they affect the behavioral piece. And remember, the behavioral element is one of the two critical dynamics you need to fully protect your workforce and your environment. We need to address the behavior. We need to address the technology. So with that, I'll end and wrap up my section, pass this along to George and Sean to build further on the technology.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve. And I think you're going to stay around and answer some questions for us at the end, right? I know I've seen a number of them come in. Perfect. Okay. All right. Well, welcome, everybody. We're going to talk a little bit about how you can operationalize technology. And I want to key in on a few things that Steve talked about. We're going to get specific about what you can do in preparedness and engagement, hopefully to prevent, where technology can help you in the moment if an active shooter event does occur. And as well, we're going to talk about what we can do afterwards. I'm sorry, my slides just went a little too far. One back. There we go. We did a study with Forrester just a couple of years ago, and we asked organizations what kinds of events or critical events they had suffered in the past 24 months. And it really was astounding how many organizations faced an active shooter or an active assailant. So 11% of organizations answered affirmatively, and that's just a shocking number. So I hope to see an update on that study soon to see what that trend looked like. But when we think about those situations and those active shooter incidents, they're also very expensive to our organization. Obviously, the loss of life is our number one concern, or preventing injuries, but it is also a big impact to an organization in terms of direct dollar costs or indirect costs. And they continue long after the active shooter incident itself. These get into things like required upgrades to your safety and security systems. There are probably going to be some programs you need to put in place for your own staff or contractors to help them get through the trauma of that incident. There are going to be lots of lawsuits. That happens all the time. And so we could expect legal costs, costs of retaining camera data, other information that may be required from either regulatory agencies or for those lawsuits. That's going to have costs. You're going to have costs in terms of communications, PR firms, internal, external, all of those constituencies, including the public that you're going to face. As well, there are going to be a lot of operational impacts. And for the Virginia Tech shooting that happened a number of years ago, that cost is estimated at $48 million and likely still going on. Again, those impacts last long after the actual incident itself. So we often talk about critical events, and we wonder, why is this so difficult to manage? And Steve talked about the human element. That is a big factor in all of this. And when some of these events are occurring, the trauma of them in the moment, the panic, but there is a lot more to that than the human element at that moment. We really want to think about, for our own team, how we can do better. And the challenges that organizations often face are really understanding what is going on when the active shooter incident occurs. Is the information coming from truly a reliable source? People need to know what kind of weapons are involved. Are there automatic weapons? Is it a knife? Is it something else? Where is it taking place? How long ago? How severe is it? Is there more than one person, or is it a single lone actor? In this kind of an incident, of course, we should care, but that's not necessarily true of every critical event, because a lot of times it's unclear whether this is truly affecting your organization, or is the information so vague that it's somewhere across town. That's something that you really need to figure out. And unless you have a good source of information, that can be hard to understand in the moment. But there are a lot of impacts potentially to your organization, your people directly affected. It could be also some of your key business partners. What we need to do and how we need to respond, we need to take some of that manual processes off the table. A lot of organizations have processes that are I'll say loosely digital, perhaps. They are they could be in binders, but more likely they're on something like SharePoint. And while I'm sure a lot of you drill for that, those plans sometimes need to be activated in a quicker fashion for something like an active shooter incident. You can't spend the time to go get that. You have to be able to kick off those plans really quickly. So that's a challenge a lot of organizations have. And then after the incident, it's often challenging to analyze performance. That takes time. Do you have systems that are actually capturing some of that information? So those are all challenges that organizations have in the moment or when they're trying to take on the post-action response. So what we do know, though, is that the quicker we can respond, usually the greater the impact, or we can help prevent more loss of life, help prevent more injuries, resolve the situation more quickly, protect our people, protect our assets, and keep our operations running. So Steve talked a lot about Lewin's equation and how this affects our response, and even prior to the actual incident, how this affects people's behavior. And I do want to highlight that what we're seeing and what Steve talked about, this is a real challenge as we get into the hybrid work environment. It really is a lot more difficult when we don't know where the people are that we're responsible for protecting. And that is this notion of work in motion, or the hybrid workforce. And this actually looks a lot like my calendar this week and next week. Today I'm in the office, in our Lansing, Michigan office. Yesterday I was at my home office. Tomorrow I'm going to be traveling for personal reasons. Monday I'm on a road trip. I'm not going to be driving a truck like the slide, but I am going to be visiting a customer command center in another city. And so having all of that different location, I'm going to be in a number of different environments. I'm going to be in a number of different cities. Today, Lansing, tomorrow in Detroit, and then in Columbus later on. So my organization, needs to know where I am if it's going to better protect me. So these are examples of some of the challenges we have in each of those environments, and they include things like going into the office, performing those wellness tests. In some cases, they're vaccine requirements, understanding occupancy thresholds, but then the office environment for an active assailant, and as Steve said, that might be very different from our home office. And then that's compounded when people are traveling, when they're in an environment. Detroit is not a place I am all the time. I know my way around, but I don't really know what's going on in Detroit nor Columbus. So that just kind of ups the ante and makes it more important that the organization has tools and has a way to help protect me based on where I am and knowing what's going on around me in those places. So just how big is this challenge? We were able to find some studies on this. It really is very, very dependent on the industry. If you're in manufacturing, you're not likely to be somebody who's remote. You probably never were even in the pandemic. But for a lot of so-called white-collar jobs, you can work remotely, and I work remotely at least half time. I'm sure a lot of my colleagues are in that same model. But there are some organizations, you probably heard a few of their names, have gone 100% remote. No more offices. We're just going to have meeting spaces that you can get together in and collaborate. But more often we're seeing hybrid model, and that's kind of that mix of part-time office, part-time, at-home work. And about 74% of companies have said that's going to be their model going forward. Among the populations, though, of workers, what we have seen are the people who are fully nomadic, so-called digital nomads. Those are really about the hardest folks to protect. And there are a lot of them, and they are growing. And they have traditional white-collar jobs, but I could probably work from anywhere if I wanted to. That could be on a houseboat. It could be in another country. You hear a lot about people going to warm, sunny places and working from there for a few months. So that's tremendously difficult for companies to do their duty of care when you don't even know where the people are. So this is going to be getting bigger, already about 15 million people, and we expect that trend to continue over time. So again, this ups our ante and means that we just have more work to do to protect those people. They're outside of our kind of traditional walls. We've got to do some more work. So fortunately, we do have a lot of technology that can help both before. This is the during to help us assess, locate, act, analyze. That's our framework. And then afterwards. So this is how we could think of that life cycle, and technology can absolutely play a role in all of these places. It can help in the planning, preparation, and prevention. So Steve talked about a few of those things like SOPs and evacuation plans. Have you reviewed those plans since the pandemic, since you've started hybrid work model for your organization? If you haven't, it's probably time to take a look at those. We need to understand our partners, the assets that we have at our disposal for response, as well as who is responsible for those assets. We need to know additional response resources. We need to make sure we have communication plans. We need to accommodate people who may be not mobile or may have other physical needs or emotional needs that we need to take special care of in a active shooter situation. And then this is the really important part of the preparation, is those employee resources, the mental health and wellness benefits that many organizations provide, and making that really, really accessible to organizations. So many organizations have mobile apps where you can just push a button and on your smartphone and access some of those resources. We really think of those. Those are great. Those are a way for people to easily get that, but also a way for people to report behavior that might be concerning to them. Here in Michigan, our school kids, a lot of them have access to the OK to Say app, where they can anonymously provide a tip. Might be anything related from bullying to some concern about somebody who might be exhibiting the behaviors that Steve talked about. And then finally, also Steve talked about this, how important is training and operational exercises so that you drill this and everybody knows, and they keep doing it so that they don't get it wrong. Not that you just get it right the first time, but that you don't get it wrong. And that you use those drills and operational exercises and you document that so that you improve and you improve your processes. You get people to not have as much of that fear level, so that when the situation does occur, they're gonna act like you want them to act. And then we'll talk more about the technology in just a moment around your assess, locate, act, analyze framework. I think your post-action improvements are a lot of the same things you talk about in your planning and preparation. You use the data from the incident to review, update, and adjust. You can make it better, right? We learn, we make it better, so hopefully we never have to do it again. All right, so when we think about that framework, how can we use technology to help us in the moment of assess? And we think of assess as what was happening, where is it, all those kinds of things. So first, really having strong multi-category risk intelligence that's vetted. You know where it is, you know when it is, what's happening. A professional is providing that information to you. Very important part of your assess program. Many organizations have linked to local law enforcement. I'm aware of a number of folks who have in their command center the law enforcement connections from their CAD systems. It's coming right into a corporate command center. And so they know what's going on in the town where they're operating, or even more broadly, multiple towns where they're operating. And there are a lot of technology tools that are out there, things like Nixle that can give you that insight and that local law enforcement intelligence. It's very up to the moment what's going on. We think social media is another great enhancement to risk intelligence. This could include things that are specific to the community that you're in, or it could include things like your company name, a school name, names of individuals. If you're in certain industries that tend to be targets of activism, petroleum is one of those, pharmaceutical is another one. Those are things you might want to have keyword searches for. Sometimes your executives are targeted. So having that source of intelligence is also helpful. Helpful to have, again, so you have a comprehensive picture. A lot of mobile apps out there have SOS buttons on them, and that information can go right back to your command center so that if something is happening, you can quickly get a geolocated alert into your command center and security team so they can start to take action. And that's a great augmentation. We always would say those traditional panic buttons under the desk, the red buttons on the wall, those are always going to be awesome as well. But you should have those integrated into one place so that there aren't multiple signals coming in necessarily in multiple systems. Shot detection systems, a great way, again, to understand where something is happening, that it happened, and they're quick. and they're very reliable. And then finally, E911 systems. This will help us understand, in a large building or a large campus, where might this be taking place? What floor? It's really important to know on a 100-story building in New York or Chicago or something like that, where, what floor is something taking place? And if somebody's calling in, we need to be able to direct law enforcement, and you're going to need a technology like that. And then I think, another source that could help you prevent or identify very quickly are weapons detection systems. So a lot of camera systems are starting to include this, or facial recognition. If you have somebody who has exhibited some behaviors before, that might be somebody who you put onto a list to look for, showing up perhaps in a place at your work site that they're not supposed to be, might be an indication that something's about to happen. All right, so that's the first part, which is assess. The second part is really locate. Where are locations of local police, fire, EMS? That's information that you can use technology to have at your fingertips. You shouldn't have to go look for that information or do a search. If you can't get it within about 30 seconds, also hospitals and trauma centers, that's probably too long. So we really encourage you to have that information, and you can use technology to do that in a system, like a critical event management systems. Public and traffic cameras are a great source, not just your own cameras I'm talking about, but these are cameras that might be in public places. Traffic cameras might also give you a little bit of insight on what's happening as it's unfolding. These are often, again, outside of your perimeter. You often need to know what's happening with suppliers and distribution partners. Sometimes these are co-located with your own facility, so they're in some ways a part of your operations. But if something's happening there that could spill over into your own organization, you really need to know about that. And of course, your own footprint. So where do we have buildings? Where do we have other assets that we need to protect? Parts of, not just an office, but maybe data centers, distribution warehouses, and each one of those locations need to have emergency points of contact. That could be local law enforcement, local information. That should all be tied to those records that you have in your technology. We talked about the challenge of the mobile workforce. So if I've decided that I'm going to go book that Airbnb in Aruba and I'm going to work there for a month, which sounds fantastic, how does my organization know I'm there? You need to give people an easy way to share their location. You could do that with a mobile app. You could tie into your into reservation systems. You could ask them to manually do it in some kind of a travel system. But we think it's important that you give employees the ability to self-serve and to set an expectation that they update their own information, their contact information, where they are, and you can expose that through like a portal where they can just type in, I'm going to be in Aruba for a month, or I'm working from home. I've had to go relocate to Albuquerque because my mother-in-law is not doing so well and we need to help take care of her. Make it easy for people, and there's lots of great technology to do that. So I did talk about the travel, but dynamic location is really important. There are a lot of systems that are available to organizations to help tie those things together to automatically update the likely location of a person so that when we do need to account for them, we're more likely to know where they are and be accurate in our mustering or 100% employee accounting requirements. You should also have floor plans, campus plans at your fingertips, and if you have cameras, part of that system also, so that you can more quickly locate what's going on. You may even be able to share that. Ideally, you could share that, share those links with local law enforcement if they need to help you respond to this. And then finally, visitor management, right? It's not only important where your employees are, but you may have people within your building, visitors in your building, and you're going to have a duty of care to them too. So understanding that you have others there and where they are, who are they visiting, account for them, that's really key. And so you need a visitor management system to do that. The next part of this is around ACT. So we've understood now that something is happening. We've located our resources. We need to take action. So we think that a templated system to automate as much of this as possible, but be able to assign and communicate very quickly with not just your own organization, but other key stakeholders is critical. So this includes things like tasks that you assign people to do. so that they don't have to go get that book or find that SOP on SharePoint. That automatically happens. They're assigned that task, and they get a notification that they're supposed to do that, and they're off on their way. You need to have very specific audience communications, and you can have templated responses for all of these. You need to notify law enforcement, likely your own leadership, the people who are affected, security teams. There could be a lot of other stakeholders, including the general public, but as much of this as possible, you're going to want to look to automate. And we also know that what we say to people is important. Each audience needs a specific communication, but how we say it, what method we use to reach them is very important. And we have a lot of different modalities, as we call them, that it can include things like text, voice, mobile, notification push, taking over a desktop screen, putting a ticker on a monitor in a public place, automatically announcing over the loudspeakers. These are all capabilities that you should consider. Mustering forms, another great one, making sure that these are all in place and technology enabled, not a manual checklist of people, but something that can be pushed out to somebody and you can go through the current list. Incident and responder chat. So how can we chat between all the people, all the groups that may be responsible for our response to this particular incident, and ideally mobile enabled so that you can get information from the field into your command center. Very important that we drill this, as we said, and a lot of software out there, including Everbridge, has a drill or exercise mode so that you can get not just your team practicing this, but the people who might be affected, your employees that you're trying to protect, that they can practice this as well. We do also have bidirectional communication requirements in a lot of organizations so that you can achieve 100% accounting. Something's happening, we need to make sure we've accounted for 100% of our employees, and many, many organizations have that. And then a couple more, in an active shooter situation, we want to be able to enable or disable doors, access control. Perhaps we can even release fire doors so that there are not line of sight, for an active shooter, some physical barriers that they would have to get through to go to a different part of a building or a different section of our campus. So really important. So in a lockdown, that you can enable those. And then finally, of course, I think probably everybody has camera systems that, these are going to be super important that you can control and also record so that you have evidence later on. Then the final step is really around analyze. How did our team do? How did our employees do? We asked them to do certain things. We asked our stakeholders to complete certain tasks. What was our communication like? Did we get the 100% accounting for the employees that we were looking for? Did we get the communication we were expecting? And then using that, as we said in the cycle, to help us get better over time. So these are all the different key elements for enablement. Technology is out there, it's great, but you've got to practice with it, and first you have to have it in place. So Sean is going to show us now some examples of assess, locate, act, and analyze, and then how we can use technology, again, to help us prepare and respond to, and then do some post-action analysis. Sean?
Awesome. Thanks, George. Let me go ahead and share my screen for everybody so that we can talk about this in a live environment. And so, I understand that we have some questions in the chat here, so I want to be respectful of making sure that we have an opportunity to answer those. But as we start to look at this, how I've set this up is to actually come in through a specific SOS button. Obviously, George talked about utilizing shooter detection systems and hardware mounted around different facilities. I thought this would be a good use case that would allow for us to do this even if I'm not on campus, if I am somewhere else, if we are doing hybrid working, if we are traveling to a customer on site and something happens, so that allowing that employee to employer style communication. So in this case, I have mine set up just as a shortcut, hey Siri, active shooter. And so what this will allow me to do is actually say, hey Siri, active shooter. And so, sorry, I was talking over it, I apologize. Hey,
just to confirm, you'd
sorry.
like to call, okay, I won't. Who would you like to call?
Gotta love that. Sorry, 1 second, folks. Sorry. Hey Siri, active shooter. So we'll see that this is going to launch an SOS communication for me. And now it's going to count down. Now I can obviously hit SOS now, and it's going to automatically launch that communication for me. And what's going to end up happening is it's going to automatically populate directly on my screen. So let me drag my phone just out of the way here. And what we'll see is that I'll have different alerts that are available to me here within the system. So as a part of those alerts, we'll have a variety of different things that have been brought up as a part of this. And so what that can mean is that what we'll be able to do is start to understand what assets have been impacted in a given area. So as a part of those assets, I'm going to zoom in on our office here. And what we'll see is that I've got an office building right here in Atlanta that's going to allow me to understand the floor plans on what's taking place. So as a part of that, we'll be able to understand where an individual is when these things are activated, as well as what's taking place. Now, when I need to start to communicate out with people, when I need to start to understand what else is happening around a given situation, I'll have the ability to start to utilize contextual items based on what's taking place. So as a part of that, what we'll see is I've actually pulled up different things here in terms of our context feeds to understand, as George was mentioning, in a few quick clicks, where hospitals are, where emergency responses are. And all of that needs to be able to be found quickly and understand where those things are. So making sure that I'm sending people to hospitals that have trauma centers, right? Just understanding where a hospital is isn't enough. And so I'll be able to understand where those different things are, right? So trauma centers are actually occurring over here at this Summit Ridge Hospital, or at those different locations. So being able to understand where those different things are. Now let's look back at that particular alert, and what we'll see is that, again, we'll pull that up on our floor plan, and what we'll see is where that actual individual is and where that's actually happening. Now, if I click on that specific alert, we can see that they're just outside of a stairwell is where this was originally reported. And if I click on that actual alert, we'll see that the contact information for that individual, as well as a live video feed of what's taking place. Now, obviously, mine's just going to be pointing at me at this moment, but it's allowing for us to see in real time what's taking place and hear those pieces of information. Now, I might also want to go ahead and launch an incident communication to people to let them know what's taking place. Now, when we launch this incident, what we want to be able to do is be able to communicate in different ways to different people. So I want to go ahead and send out a polling notification and make sure that people are okay. And so when I go to launch this, it's going to allow for me to communicate out with different types of individuals, right? Contacts in the area, as George mentioned, digital signage, people that are traveling in a specific area. So giving us that idea. And so when I send this out, it's going to give me a preview of what that looks like, show me who I'm sending it to, and now I'm going to be able to launch that incident. Being able to track who gets what and when very quickly and what those responses look like. Again, all coming back to one single platform so that we're able to have an informational push and start to get that information back. I'm going to pull my phone back over. We'll see that I'm starting to get a phone call. I'm going to decline that. I'll open my text messages here. We'll see there's been an Everbridge alert. Are you safe? I am safe. I need assistance. SOS. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and hit 1. I'm going to say that I'm safe so that we don't panic anybody, and let the operation know what's taken place. Now, obviously, I sent this via text message. There are going to be other circumstances where inside the building, I may not want to be sending text messages or phone calls or anything like that to individuals, which might give away where they're located around a building. So what I might want to do instead is actually send a desktop alert or send this information to digital signage, to lobbies, to different areas where we have this. And so if I've timed this right, we can also get this as a digital screen takeover. So here, let me drag my phone out of the way again, and we'll see that I've received an active shooter notification that's taken over my entire desktop. You might have less severe situations where we do tickers or popovers. Again, giving that different example of getting the right information to the right people at the right time. Now, one last piece that I'd like to talk about here is we've talked about it from an informational perspective and started to say, all right, these are the things that I need to tell people when a situation occurs. There's also going to be an opportunity for us to manage a situation from beginning to end, which goes beyond just telling people who are in the vicinity, who are in the building, what's taken place. And George mentioned that as a part of managing a situation and mitigating risk. And in this case, we might take some of those process and say, you know what, let's go ahead and launch a new critical event here, and I'm going to activate my active shooter situation. As a part of that, I have different task lists that are assigned to different people. I have different incident communications, right, that are going to go out, and I'm going to see things that, are you safe? Have we sent these different things out? Have they received these communications? And so giving us that idea on what we've pushed out and what those different things are so that individuals can start to work on these things together and limit that risk. Now, obviously, this goes beyond just active shooters, but it's making sure, again, the right people have the right information at the right time. So I can even drill down into those pieces of information here in terms of who's seen what, again, starting to understand who's confirmed, who said they're safe, again, putting it all in one spot so everyone can see and work off of the same single pane of glass. I wanted to make sure that I left enough time for questions and answers at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and make sure that we have an opportunity to address those.
All right, thank you so much, Sean. So with that, we have a lot of questions, and looking at the clock, I don't think we'll have the opportunity to address all of those. So if your question is not answered, I will be sharing this list with our Everbridge folks, and they will follow up with you directly. All right, our first question. This one is for Steve. In terms of approaching a situation that you feel is elevating towards violent behavior, how do we start to approach the individual conversation-wise?
So conversation-wise, we start with a principle that's known as supportive acknowledgement. If you just think about those two words, supportive acknowledgement, it means that we acknowledge the behavioral change we see. We go to the person and maybe we say as a coworker or a supervisor, hey, listen, I know you pretty well. I see some things are changing. You're acting a little bit differently. I'm concerned. Are you okay? Do you need help? And that's the supportive piece. Tell me what we could do. If it's a person who's struggling in some way, very often we can create that off-ramp where we connect them to the EAP or other services for some mental health support or whatever else the issue is to make sure we get it. So in many instances, we can actually initiate early conversation with a person of concern through that route of supportive acknowledgement. But I do want to qualify that to say that if the behavior is telling us that the person is pretty far along that pathway towards violence, we may have missed that opportunity for early intervention, and the risk is becoming more imminent, where we need to kick in the mechanism of a threat assessment process, know again when we need a stronger intervention. But at the lowest level, if you hold on to that concept of supportive acknowledgement, it's a great way to start the discussion.
All right, thank you, Steve. George, do you have anything to add there?
Well, yeah, there were a couple of questions I'll just try and answer that I saw come across. There was one that was around potential reluctance of employees to share, especially geolocation on their device, but potentially with other things as well. I think that's a cultural issue as well as an education issue that we like to say, probably something you're not going to solve overnight, but something that you can work on over time. We have a lot of best practices that we introduce to organizations that are implementing Everbridge technology to help them get over that hump. Our professional services team is long used to getting that kind of question. And a lot of it involves helping employees understand that this is a benefit to them. We are trying to help protect you. And to boil it down to that message is pretty strong, but it does take time. There was another question I saw that had to do with, being able to send a message and concern about tip lines. The person might be maybe having some retribution against somebody else, and so it might be a little bit of a false tip. I think like every tip, it's something that you need to investigate appropriately. You certainly don't want to have, swatting or any incident like that take place. I think that has to be something that you develop a process for within your organization, document, and then follow that process every single time, and make sure that you've documented that you followed that process, because you wouldn't want there to be any question that you did or didn't do the right thing or take something seriously or not seriously.
So if I could build on those two questions for a moment as well, from a behavioral standpoint, some of the behavioral research tells us about things like getting people to adopt, location, sharing a location and such. is that when we tell employees that a threat, let's say active shooter, can directly affect them, it can be very severe, but there's things that they could do, like, again, use their tools and their technologies appropriately and sign up for these things. And there's things that companies could do to help. We actually get better adoption. But that means that it's presented to them. We have that discussion about sharing their geolocation and such, while we may be doing other training on workplace violence prevention or active shooter. That's part of the same discussion. When you simply approach someone and say, hey, listen, we need your location, the natural response is to become a little defensive, like, why, right? Because that's all about control. So you have to provide it in context. As was just said, you have to have them understand that there's a benefit to them. To the other question about the maybe malicious report of a problem, a person of concern, we never want to act on a single point, a single data point, a single piece of information, because it could be unreliable. So this circles back to the idea of a threat assessment team, and to the answer, before, about that really triggering an investigation or a closer look at the situation, so that we're not reacting prematurely based on one interpretation of someone's behavior. So all of these ideas are consistent. They all tie together, and again demonstrate the importance of the behavior and the technology working hand in hand.
All right.
So Raquel, back to you. Sorry about that. Back to you for wrapping up.
No worries. Thank you. So we've received so many questions. So again, to our audience, I will be sharing your questions with our panelists, and someone will follow up with you directly after the presentation. So Steve Commando, George Siegel, and Sean McDevitt, thank you so much for your time, sharing your expertise and insights. And thank you to Everbridge for sponsoring today's webinar. To our attendees, we hope that you've enjoyed today's presentation. In a moment, our program will conclude and an evaluation will pop up. The evaluation takes less than 3 minutes to complete, so please share your thoughts about today's webinar. ASIS values your feedback as we look to schedule future programming. Lastly, completion of this webinar is eligible for 1 CPE credit. CPE credit will be updated directly into your user profile within 48 hours. Thank you again for joining today's presentation. You will now be redirected to the webinar evaluation.